Kate Andrews, it's not about socialism, it's about economic mishandling.
Socialism has never been successful anywhere in the world, at any time in history. Look at North Korea, look at South China, look at the Soviet Union, now look at Venezuela. When you try, through force, to make everything run through the state, people die. There's no two ways of looking at that. When we talk about the NHS, when we talk about rail, when we talk about things that the government may have some involvement in, this is all operating in free market capitalist societies. How do you think the NHS is paid for? It's paid for by taxpayers who are out in a free society making money, making profit, able to spend that on lots of what they choose to, and also handing over a portion to the state. It's simply not true, by the way, that the NHS is some kind of socialist miracle. It's one of the worst healthcare systems in the developed world. So I reject that point completely, but we're not talking about...
It's also a healthcare system that many other countries aspire to and admire.
Oh, that's not true. No other developed country, apart from Ireland, has adopted the NHS like for like. The best countries that have the best healthcare systems tend to be in Europe, where you have significantly more free market provisions. When we talk about countries that tend to be more left-wing than the UK, like in Scandinavia, looking at Sweden, they have significantly more private provisions in their healthcare service. This idea that a socialist healthcare service is envied is simply not the case. In terms of what people actually pick up and use, it's not the NHS. But back to Venezuela. To suggest that this is simply a bad government would overlook the history, the horrific history of socialist regimes around the world. And when you try to incorporate everybody into the state, to take away their autonomy as individuals, take away their ability to be traders and profit makers, to essentially crack down on the innate human spirit that we all have to engage with each other in trade, results in mass death. And if you look at what's happening in Venezuela, it's all you need to know. Socialism doesn't work. We can talk about a more left-wing policy when it comes to healthcare or tax. We can talk about increasing tax rates. That's fine. But don't talk about socialism. Socialism has been tried many times, and it's always failed.
Let's have a look at the socialist policies. Food price controls, for example, may have been brought in, Dawn Foster, to try and make it more affordable for the poor, but they've spectacularly backfired now, haven't they? Look at the statistics. Average person having lost 11 kilograms in weight last year. We have a situation where people can't get medicines. We've got 2 million people fleeing the country, comparable with Syria. Whatever the intention was behind those socialist policies, they're not working.
No, completely. And I think most people, myself included, when we saw these measures coming in, it was very, very clear that it wasn't going to work. If you tell people that you are going to do something in an emergency, such as try and stockpile things, try and limit the amount of food people can buy, people respond naturally and they stockpile themselves, they panic themselves. And it's important to note that actually the reason Venezuela is in this position is not purely because they decided to adopt socialism. It's because when they decided to vote in a socialist government, they were met by sanctions in the US, and we've seen this across Latin America and in Cuba. America have used sanctions. They're a very, very capitalist economy. They've used sanctions to really make things a lot harder for any country that dares to adopt any form of socialism.
We'll talk a bit more about sanctions in a moment, Dawn Foster, but we had under Chavez the nationalisation of the oil industry, of agricultural operations, of transport, of telecoms, of power generation, steel, for example. Where are those industries now? They were driven into the ground.
Yes, they were, because actually nationalisation is not a bad idea, but when it's done badly, it is very bad. Just as in practice, privatising things isn't always a bad idea. We look at our rail system; it's dreadful. And actually, socialising a lot of things is a very, very popular, move when you poll the public. The vast majority of the British public would rather see trains, they'd rather see utilities brought into national control and run not for profit but for the people. And I think collectivising these things is very, very popular because a lot of people do feel uncomfortable with the idea that you can make profit out of things that people have no choice over, such as need in shelter, need in fuel, need in food. And so nationalisation is very, very popular amongst the British public. And, as Kate said, you look at Scandinavia. When it's done right, it works perfectly. There's a great healthcare system. People can afford their housing there. They're much happier. So I think, you have to allow people the decision to vote in a socialist government or a capitalist government. And you can't just blanket say that it's completely, untestable, because all that happens is you get big powers like the US trying their hardest to undermine socialist governments through sanctions, through through all sorts of meddling. And Venezuela have had an extraordinary time of trying to bring a country together with a lot of outside forces trying to undermine them purely because.
Okay, Kate Andrews, what about those outside forces, US sanctions, for example?
This idea that the U.S. forced Maduro and Chavez to seize over 1,000 companies and bring them into the private sector, that the U.S. is somehow responsible for that, is just completely nonsense. The idea that the U.S. is responsible for the price controls that were implemented in Venezuela, for their huge reliance on oil reserves and only oil reserves, is nonsense. The idea that the U.S. is responsible for the crackdown on the free press and for attacks on opposition parties and for the authoritarian regime that exists there now, which is torturing and killing its own people, is ridiculous. I'm not saying that there aren't outside issues when it comes to the U.S. relationship with many other countries around the world, the way that sanctions work. I mean, I believe very strongly in free trade. I think it's one of the best ways to liberate a country. But it is very clear that the socialist policies of Venezuela are what have over 2 million people trying to flee and an estimated 2 million people more by 2020. This is on the same level as the Syrian crisis, to put it in perspective. People have seen what socialism is, and they're trying to get away from it. And Scandinavia is not socialist. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, they don't even have a minimum wage. Sweden's education system is based on the principles of the free market economist Milton Friedman. These are countries that are fundamentally capitalist, have relatively low corporation tax, significantly lower than the US is, but they redistribute more money. And so if you want to have a conversation about tax rates in the UK and what needs to be redistributed, very happy to do that. You want to have a conversation about socialism and why we need to overthrow capitalism, which is the best man-made creation of producing wealth and also redistributing that wealth, and you want to replace that with a socialist regime of the likes of what we see in Venezuela, forget it. This is nonsense, and I don't think anybody sitting at home wants it. People want to feel free. They want to be able to trade. They want to be able to make profit. And yes, some should be redistributed and given to those who need it so we have a safety net. But as Scandinavia shows us, you don't need socialism to do that. And as Venezuela shows us, when you bring in socialism, you lose lives.
In terms of redistribution of wealth, Dawn Foster, there should have been plenty to go around, shouldn't there? This was a country with the world's largest oil reserves, and then when the oil price collapsed, so did the economy. Venezuela was a country that relied totally on its oil industry. It didn't produce anything else in the end, and therefore this is where it's at.
No, completely. And if you want to know what should have been done with the oil, you should look at what happened in Sweden and Norway. They did what we didn't. I mean, Margaret Thatcher sold off oil and lost a lot of money for the British people, whereas Norway and Scandinavia have been a lot more careful. They've used very socialist ideas about collectivism and redistribution, and that's why when you look at Norway and Scandinavia, who are socialists, the parties say they are. They're running along processes of redistribution. Then actually, a rising tide does lift all boats. The problem is that when you get to really hyper-capitalist countries, you can make profit, but only a small number of people can, and then there's very little kind of political will to actually bring in the taxes that will redistribute it. You get people who are trying to avoid the wider world through private schools, through tax evasion and avoidance sometimes, and it doesn't work. And the only problem, I think the biggest problem in Sweden is actually the fact that when it comes to schools, it became very, very capitalist. We had charter schools, we had free schools, they were all externally funded, and there have been huge problems in them, whereas, when you look at Britain, good state schools, when they're allowed to, run very well. And, instead we get a small number of private schools who use a lot of accounting to avoid paying more tax. So, as I said, the British public are very happy with ideas such as nationalisation. They voted a huge number for a pretty socialist Labour Party. And when capitalism...
I'm just going to bring in Kate Andrews for a quick response to that before we're out of time.
Socialists... a socialist labor leader who said that Venezuela essentially shows us that something better is possible, and Venezuela is not better, and that should never come to the UK. Redistribution is not a principle of socialism. The difference between capitalism and socialism is how do you want to generate that wealth? Who should the ownership go to? And capitalism has proven time and time again that it can generate that wealth to then be redistributed. I think it's ironic, but not totally surprising, that it's estimated that the wealthiest Venezuelan is Hugo Chavez's daughter. That is not a fair and equal society. And I want to know, my last point is, I want to know, what is the one policy proposal that people who claim Venezuela isn't real socialism, what's the one policy proposal that you could give to turn that situation into one that didn't result in as many deaths as it had? What's that one policy proposal that's going to take for people to realize that real socialism has been tried and it never works?
OK, Kate Andrews, Dawn Foster, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both.